sorry, I had information about recording. And we know that it is very hard to deliver full decarbonization in the power system without the technologies that will work on the margin. And this probably means CCS, because we have some parts of the energy system, like central heating in large cities, like peaking power plants, like plants that are working as reserves that may be very hard to decarbonize fully. Moreover, we have problem in the industry, in some industry like cement industry that needs some options for decarbonization, that at the moment those options are not on the table apart from the CCS technology. So, so when low-hanging fruits in the energy systems are going to be picked up, the burden of the decarbonization will need to be taken over by the hard to abate emissions industries like heavy industry, district heating system, balancing energy supply, and last but not least, negative emission solutions that will remove parts of the CO2 that was already emitted in the past from the atmosphere. Therefore, CCS or CCS in Q is the technology that might be, and we strongly believe that it will be, one of the key solutions to fit this role in the future. But in order to make it happen, the deployment must happen now, so over the next decade or so, which means that CCS needs to be scaled up at the commercial scale. It needs research, it needs pilots and demonstration projects, and last but not least, cooperations beyond borders, because probably because of the scale of the project, not a single country can deliver it fully on the commercial basis. So regional synergies through scientific, technological, knowledge sharing cooperation, cross-border infrastructure projects are key to find a viable solution for the CCS technology for Europe and not only Europe in the future. So given high dependence on fossil fuel and high degree of industrializations of our region, and also hope to industrialize further as one of the key sources of the economic development of Central Europe, we have special interests in developing the CCS technology. When done right, the region can become one of the European global leaders in CCS deployment. So that's what we strongly believe in the project. So I hope that the conference will be very interesting for you. We have numerous participants, almost 100, I believe, or even more. So thank you for coming. Good wishes for fruitful discussions. And I would like to give floor to Karolina Marszał, so that she will lead you through the project itself and the meeting today.
Thank you, Maciej. My name is Karolina Marszał. I'm an analyst at WiseEuropa. And before we move to the project overview, I would like you to look in the chat, because there will be a link to our first interactive question, namely, when will we see an industrial scale of CCS project in CEE? And you have a few options to choose: within 5 years, within 10 years, in more than 10 years, or never. So in the chat, there is a link. You can vote, and we will come back to it with the results later. So now I would like to present a quick overview of the project that is the basis for our today's conference. Next slide, please. But firstly, I would like to say a couple of words about our institution. So we are an independent think tank based in Warsaw, and we are not only focusing on energy and climate, but on a broader topics such as social economic development and foreign policy at the national and European level. Next slide, please. The main aim of the project is to renew the discussion on the long-term deployment of CCS technology in the CEE region, because as probably many of you remember, we had similar discussion like about 10 years ago, but in different setting, different contexts and assumptions. But now, as we are moving into the climate neutrality target, we see more space for CCS emerging once again. In terms of our focus, we were focused mainly on socioeconomic and socio-political aspects of CCS deployment through preparing assessments and roadmaps for action, and also supporting these new policies and projects across the border, because we can see that significant gap remains in recognizing these socioeconomic and political aspects, and also of getting stakeholders together and establishing this kind of regional cooperation. We aimed to have a broad geographic coverage within our project, namely we have included Poland, Czech Republic, Slovakia, Hungary, Slovenia, Croatia, Romania, Baltic states, and Ukraine. So you can see that we have a broad set of countries in different contexts, so that there is a lot of potential for us to cooperate. But we need to start this and prepare specific studies and action plans. So that's the project is to help with these goals. Next slide, please. I also want to mention that at the same time, we have a great project partners team and great enabling conditions to launch the project. So as a leader partner, we, WiseEuropa, coordinate the whole project with Bellona being expertise partner, representing excellent knowledge from Norway and also their engagement on a European level on CCS deployment. We have also great CEE project partners, namely Civita from Latvia, Energy Policy Group from Romania, and Institute for European Integration with support of Europa from Czech Republic. Each partner, together with national experts, also from neighboring countries, provides national insights on the current state, past experiences, and potential for CCS deployment, and also identifies relevant actors. This way, we want to geographically cover as much as possible, and also we will try to reach out even beyond this geographic scope with outreach activities. And these activities are possible thanks to the EEA and Norway grants, and we are also among the 20 projects which were selected to be implemented over the next few years. I would also like to note that our activities are co-financed by Polish funding scheme for NGOs. And I think that it is also a positive sign that there is indeed recognition of this long-term potential for the topic of CCS technology. Next slide, please. So what are the main steps in the project in terms of timeline? And there are 3 steps established for 3 years, as you can see on the screen. In September this year, we finished preparation of the assessment of current state in order to better understand where we are, what has happened over the last years, what hasn't worked previously, and what could be done in other way. So in the analysis, we were focused on national level in this mentioned area, 11 countries, and also look at the state of regional cooperation in that area, also on policy landscape and state of technology. And this gathered knowledge is the base for the next step, namely to prepare national roadmaps with cooperation and consultation with relevant stakeholders. And this step is planned to be finished in the next year. Moving on, the last point is indicated in 2023. So we want to disseminate this whole work results and make it to the public. And we want to move from the roadmaps to support the networking activities. After every step of the project, we are planning to make an annual conference like this to update the public about our research, our work development. So this is a general overview of the project. I hope you, in some part, you will be part of this further cooperation. Thank you very much, and over to you, Isabella.
Thank you, Karolina. And now, please welcome our first special guest, Krzysztof Bolesta from European Commission. Mr. Bolesta, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Good morning, all. I'll try to share my screen to just browse through some slides. It'll only take a minute. Right. I wanted to basically show you a bit of history of CCS in the European Commission and where we are today and what impact the Green Deal and Fit for 55 package have on the policy making in terms of CCS. I think it starts in around 2007, and some of you may remember it was the first big energy and climate package, the famous 20-20-20 by 2020, announced by the Commission headed by President Barroso, and then there was place first time for recognizing CCS as the technology to get us to our climate and energy targets. And we had a very broad objective, but quite ambitious one. So to have CCS commercially viable by 2020. We are today in 2021, so you might probably know how we fared. Anyway, our first effort was quite comprehensive, to be honest. We preferred enabling legislation. We had funding mechanisms, more than one, famous NER 300. So revenues from the EU ETS were set aside, and they were dispersed to innovative decarbonization projects. We had a demonstration program. So we selected 12 different projects around Europe. One was actually in the region in Poland. We had designed a knowledge sharing mechanism for all of them to advance the learning quickly. And we also help with deploying infrastructure, mapping where potential storage sites in Europe are. And of course, research was always supported through the Horizon 2020 mechanism. As I said, Bełchatów was one of the 12 that got the money from our mechanisms, almost well, more than $250 million of euro at the time, but well, none of the projects are around today. So what happened? Well, I think the major blow to the whole CCS exercise was the carbon price at the time. So in our impact assessments, we were looking at the level of 30 euro. And when the first projects were selected, the price dropped, and it sustained at the level of more or less 5 euro throughout the period where it was key for the projects to go ahead. So all of them, one by one, simply folded because there was no business case. And instead of the moon landing, we had a moon crash. Basically, what happened was, as I said, mainly the CO2 price that didn't carry the project. But I think it's also fair to say that at the time it was quite ambitious to invest in CCS when our climate and energy objectives were quite modest at the time. So 20% CO2 reduction. That was not significant enough for industries and power sector to actually invest in expensive technologies like CCS. Basically, power sector had better options, cheaper options. Even switching to gas was enough at the time to reduce your emissions. You didn't have to do CCS. Well, there's a lot of fault on our side as well. We oversight the demonstration exercise. We were counting on big projects minimum 250 megawatts of capacity in the power sector, and we wanted every project to have their own transport option and storage, so integrated value chain of CCS. So not only big, but very complicated. On top of that, getting money from the mechanism, funding mechanism, was not really easy. And of course, on top of that, an issue of public awareness piled up. That was the case in Bełchatów. Before they actually stopped before of the funding problems. They just decided to leave the project because of the public acceptance issues around the storage site. So not all is lost, because we learned an awful lot because of the exercise. We now know that integrated projects are possibly well, a no-go. It's really impossible to deploy a point-to-source integrated big project. Lack of CO2 infrastructure stops many industrial projects that would like to capture CO2, but they just don't want to invest in transport and storage. They just would like to have access to the infrastructure. I think that a big issue still facing us today, and our new efforts to deploy new policy on CCS, is that we do not have demonstration projects in Europe, and it harms our credibility, because it's still regarded as something of a science fiction, despite the fact that all the elements of the value chain are well demonstrated and function around the world. One very big problem that I think we will still be facing many years into the future is that CCS in Europe is associated with fossil fuels, because it was designed initially as a means to help coal plants fit with the climate targets, and still today this is regarded as something of a black sheep in the decarbonization family, which is not the case, because we realized through modeling and also talking to the industry that CCS, and also increasingly CCU, so carbon capture and utilization, is an important technology for getting to climate neutrality. How so? Well, our modeling shows that even up to 600 million tons of CO2 will be captured in 2050 annually. So this is quite a lot. It's almost twice of all emissions in Poland today. So that gives you an idea of how much CO2 could be captured in this one of the scenarios that we find quite credible. Of course, CCS is in a different place that we initially thought it would be. It's not a solution for power sector, we think, but rather an option for hard to abate sectors, to decarbonize industries like cement, like steel, like chemical production. And also, of course, it will have a role in the power sector, because some of the gas plants will stick around 2050, and you have to decarbonize them somehow. So maybe CCS will become an option for them as well. Of course, we have a strategy to get to green hydrogen, but in the stages leading to getting to all green hydrogen, there's a role to be played for blue hydrogen. So hydrogen produced with gas with the application of CCS. And of course, a new thing that we are trying to promote right now is the CCS combined with sustainable biomass production to create carbon removals. Not only sustainable biomass, but all biogenic sources of CO2. If you capture them and store them permanently underground, you will have created negative emissions. And this will be crucial, because some of the sectors of the economy will never get rid of their emissions. So it will be sort of an offset. We have quite a few policy measures that are either being revised or proposed under the Green Deal and under Fit for 55. There is a EU ETS revision that includes an option to store CO2 in products. Details will be elaborated when the work on the revision starts in earnest next year. But what it does in essence is that if you emit CO2, you could instead put it in products like, say, plastics or cement, and then so the procedure will be MRV, so monitoring and guidelines will be elaborated to actually say that if you do it in certain time span, it could be regarded as non-emitted. There's of course sustainable taxonomy that puts CCS as one of the sustainable technologies, so it's eligible for green, to be in line with green sustainable taxonomy. And what I mentioned already, so we are working on a policy paper recognizing carbon removals. Actually, tomorrow we will publish a communication on carbon removals, and next year there will be a legislative measure, so how to certify carbon removals. Funding mechanisms are also under revision, so trans-European energy networks, where you could fund CO2 infrastructure. Horizon Europe still helping research and innovation on, in terms of CCS and also CCU. The Innovation Fund is growing also under the EU ETS revision. It will only get bigger, of course, if the member states and the Parliament agree, because this is, at this stage, this is just the Commission's proposal. And last but not least, we just finalizing the EU recovery package. So member states got a 750 billion euro to spend on the recovery after COVID, and 37% will have to be spent on climate-related targets, and CCS is eligible technology under the mechanism, and I will show you soon how many countries actually use that mechanism to invest in CCS. I think that it's fair to say that we are experiencing a second dawn of CCS and CCU now as well, because of the fact that we have new ambitious targets. So it's not like 2020 targets where companies could have opted for different technologies. Now, with climate neutrality by 2050, many industries just do not have anything else to do. So CCS is their way forward. I hope probably you hear more about this from the next presentation. The carbon price is showing the way, and it's becoming attractive for many installations actually to invest in carbon capture. Taxonomy is helping as well. And of course, the switch of focus I told you about. So we are now funding smaller projects, not integrated, and this actually helps, we hope, to actually spur the investment in the sector faster. It's the CCS is solution for industry, blue hydrogen, and carbon removals, and these are the three elements that I believe will actually kick off the sector development in Europe. And how many projects there are already either under planning or being deployed, you see on this slide, and the different mechanisms we are supporting them. There is one potential project in Poland, in the region. It's called EU CCS Interconnector. It's in the port of Gdańsk. It's one of our PCI projects. A couple of weeks ago, we announced funding from the Innovation Fund, and actually 4 CCS projects have been selected out of 7 decarbonization projects that got €1 billion altogether for our CCS related. And as you can see on the list, it's not power generation, but different applications in industries. They are so diverse, and this is the new look of CCS in Europe. And under the recovery package, as I mentioned already, there are quite a few member states that decided to fund CCS, and these are countries that previously thought that CCS was not way forward, like Belgium or Denmark, who basically said, okay, this is not technology we're gonna go for, but now they have strategies and they invest in CCS projects. So a different proposition altogether. If you have any questions, I'll be happy to take them. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Chris. And before giving the floor to our next special guest, I would like to invite you to answer our second question. The link you can see directly in the chat. And you have also 4 options to choose. And the question will be open during the next presentation. And now please welcome Jan Theulen from HeidelbergCement, who will present his perspectives. So Jan, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Yes, thank you. Happy to give the next presentation. And as Mr. Chris Bolesta explained, definitely CCUS is crucial for our industry and specifically for HeidelbergCement. So just to show our footprint in the world, we are in many countries present, but definitely also very present in Europe. And you can see also very present in Eastern Europe. And as the carbon constrained economy is most clear in Europe, it's very important for us to embark on those new technologies. So we have a very clear goal to realize carbon neutral concrete by 2050 at the latest. And the point is that from our process, it is hard to abate, what was already mentioned, because we are calcining calcium carbonate to calcium oxide. And that means that the majority of our emissions, they come from the raw material and not from fuels. So even if we would have 100% renewable fuels, we would still have significant process emissions. Roughly 2/3 of our emissions are process related. We have a track to become carbon neutral by 2050. And you see we have several pillars to achieve this, but CCUS is definitely a must-have pillar. And within the CCUS, CCS will be a very important part of our path to reach carbon neutrality. And therefore, I will concentrate a bit on this topic here. So the first challenge we have to deliver as cement industry, as we have a 20% CO2 concentration in our stack, is to capture it and to increase the concentration higher than 95%, maybe even higher than 99% CO2 concentration. And for that, we are embarking on 3 different main technologies. The post-combustion technology, which is also applicable for other type of industries, for the power sector, etc. Then we embark on oxy-fuel and on the direct separation technology, whereas the oxy-fuel and the direct separation technology is more cement specific. And we have developed several projects in this domain, partially sponsored by the EU, by the EU Horizon programs. And the project in oxy-fuel, it's very much covered by industry by bringing a couple of partners together. So that's for the capture part. And you can see that it's not only making plans This is our Breivik project in construction. The capture plan there, you see we first have to demolish a lot. We have to make a bit space for this new plant to come. But don't worry, we will build everything up very nicely so that ultimately we have a nice capture facility up and running in 2024. Looking at the map, already Chris Bolesta referred to it. It's all about where is storage capacity. In this map, you can see where the storage capacities are identified, those in so-called saline aquifers, that's more the green marked areas, and then the dotted gas fields are the red dotted points. Activity came in Norway, where there's a lot of storage potential, but also a very driving business, I would say, government behind it. We have a project in the UK at our Hansen cement plant close to Liverpool, and we have announced the project there in Sweden, where we want to be carbon neutral by 2030 with our big cement plant on the island of Gotland. So this is all around the North Sea, but that's not the scope of today's gathering. It's more, let's look at this area. We have in Central and Eastern Europe, there is potential, and it's important to identify what's needed to unlock this potential. Well, when we come to CCS, we identify a couple of technical challenges. One is the capture, which I already discussed on it. The second is the transport. And this has all to do with where do you put your pipelines? Do you get allowance from the landowners? What is about elevations? What's about the CO2 purity? And then we talk about storage. And there is all about what are safe areas where we can store significant volumes of CO2. And in order to get this analyzed, we are teaming up with local geological institutes, which have all those know-how available or can work to get this know-how unlocked. But apart from the technical challenges, we definitely have a lot of non-technical challenges. Stakeholder acceptance is very, very important, and it starts really with the capacity building. And I think that's what we are doing today, also in this meeting. And I have another slide to explain a bit what we are doing there more in this domain. But capacity building of local regulators, governments, and NGOs is very important so that everyone understands what is happening and how to control it and how to secure that this is done in a good way. And of course, it's all about communication and dialogue. There we definitely see the support from Bellona and the other actors today in this conference, which are mandatory to get things going. The second challenge, I would say, non-technical, is, at least for us, it's non-technical. We need to define the contracts with the oil and gas companies who will work on the storage. And it's clear that the oil and gas sector, they are changing their business cases. They are aware that oil and gas is fading out at some point in time, although it will take still decades. And they embark on hydrogen and CCS. And it's about how can you connect as cement industry to this completely other sector, and to how to deal with liabilities, etc. Finally, the access to public funding is of key importance. It's to understand very well what are those funding programs, both on EU level and on national level. What is the concept, how to respond in the most effective way to those opportunities. Then looking at the oil and gas companies. Of course, this is a very important sector, and we see this is, for example, a message which came across last week, where OMV Petrom in Romania launched their 2030 strategy, and they are embarking very clearly on carbon capture and storage. And it's not only some few nice words to say there, but you can see it's also substantial money. So some close to 2 billion euro is announced to be invested in CCS and hydrogen technologies in the next 8 years till 2030. So that's a very, very serious embarkment on new technologies, also in Eastern Europe. So not only around the North Sea domain. M&D is partner of the Czech Spicer program, which is funded by Norwegian grants, and that is really focusing on putting up the first steps into CCS in Czech Republic, showing very clearly also the commitment there from the oil and gas sector. Another example is in Croatia, where the MOL group already is operating EOR sources, EOR injection, enhanced oil recovery with CO2, and also a very recent announcement a couple of months back is that they want to further expand their activities in CCS. And yeah, then coming back to capacity building at regulators, it's very clear that we have a very nice directive from the EU on sequestration, and in many countries this directive is transferred to a national directive on how to deal with CCS. But the reality is a bit more complex. If you really want to get your permits arranged, you run into many regulations. And I just showed here the example of a project in Canada. And I guess we will in Europe have more or less the same amount of regulations as they have in Canada. And you can see how many different type of regulatory frameworks have to be met and how much paperwork is to be composed before you will get into a permit. And as we are recognizing this, we try to benefit and try to link our contacts that we have as HeidelbergCement to companies, institutes, regulators in Western Europe, in Northern Europe, in Canada, in the US, to link them and to make them available for regulators in Eastern Europe. Examples are for sure the zero emission platform, which is a very important body, I would say, to support regulators. But Gas Nova, for example, the entity from the Norwegian government, which is overlooking the complete development of the CCS project there in Norway, they have enormous know-how and are a government organization and are very keen to share this with governments in Central and Eastern Europe countries, which have to further embark with more knowledge on this. In Netherlands, of course, we have the Porthos project, where there are a couple of partners, also government type of partners behind. EBN and GasUnie are two very important partners there. And we have the knowledge centers, the Global CCS Institute, also the CCS Center in Canada, which can help in this domain. Well, then maybe what are we doing already now? What are we executing? Probably you have read somewhere in one of our press releases. We are going to pilot a capture project in Poland, in our Gorazde facility, and that will be our first pilot of carbon capture in Eastern Europe. And obviously, this is only the very first step of a journey to run into a couple of CCS projects in Eastern Europe. And when the questionnaire came, the first questionnaire which came onto my screen in this conference, I voted for that we will have the first projects in Eastern Europe within 10 years from now. And definitely we expect that HeidelbergCement will be one of the first to deliver. Important is the EU Innovation Fund. It was already mentioned. We see that a lot of applications came from Western Europe and Northern Europe. We see also the plans, the CCS projects were selected out of this region. So I think there is work to do in Eastern Europe to get projects submitted and get these funds attracted. And for that, collaboration of industry, NGOs, and governments is mandatory. And I would like to leave it here with this message. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And as we have questions to Chris and Jan, now I would like to open the discussion. Please raise your hand if you want to ask the question. You can unmute yourself.
Yeah, this is Michał from KTU. Thanks for a nice presentation. I do have a question for you. You touched upon with the oil companies, and for most of the oil companies, if the project isn't economic to get some oil out, usually the interest is pretty low. Any comments? You did mention some of your discussion with OMV and Petro Romania, and also that your project in Poland. Are oil companies involved in that? Because usually the economics play a quite important role for them.
Yeah, that's absolutely correct. Thanks for the question. The economics are definitely very important, and it's clear that the first projects in CCS, especially in the US, they were all based on enhanced oil recovery, because that was the only profit model possible. But we see that now with increasing EU ETS rates and funding mechanisms, a CCS project can also be economically feasible without EUR. And definitely in Europe, we are not embarking on EUR projects because they will not get so easy funds from Europe. And that's why we are investigating to bring the cost of capture down and to convert those projects into feasible projects. To answer your question for Poland, in the project in Poland, this is demonstrating the capture technology on a pilot scale. So that is not yet demonstrating the full value chain. So for that reason, we are they are not for the moment connected to any oil and gas company to store the CO2, because we first have to demonstrate and learn the capture technology in that specific project.
Thank you.
Thank you, Jan. And now we have a second question.
Is that my question?
Yes, yes.
Hi, Jan. This is Toby Lockwood from the Keynote Task Force. I was wondering if high ETS prices, such as we've seen recently, would be enough to drive CCS in the cement sector alone, or if it's too volatile to make an investment decision, is some kind of supporting mechanism needed? And if the ETS is enough on its own, then what kind of prices might be enough to drive projects?
Well, a price of €5 has appeared to be enough to get HeidelbergCement started. Because we started in Norway when the CO2 price was at €5. So in 2011, we have started the project in Norway because we are an industry that is long-term focused. So that was a start with pilots and getting things aligned. Of course, if you want to go in larger scale, then you cannot make your financial suicide with a project. And then the case needs to be closed. And it's clear that it's a combination of EU ETS avoidance, it's a combination of funding support, and it's a combination of a customer appetite to value a low carbon cement. So, and their public procurement can play a major role. So there are several pillars that can support and should support and are supporting the development and the deployment. And I think the strongest mechanism is a carbon contract for difference approach, because then the case is being closed, and if the EU ETS price goes up, the funding automatically goes down. So both sides have security, and both sides avoid that a project is over-supported or under-supported. So this is what we are promoting in this sense.
Thank you. And I think we have another question, Jakub Groszkowski.
Thank you very much. Thank you for very interesting presentations. I have one question to Jan and one to Krzysztof Bolesta. First question to Jan. You've been talking a bit about obstacles to develop CCS projects in the world, and I would like to ask you whether you see any specific obstacles and specific challenges in the Central Eastern European region, or the situation from your perspective is basically the same all across the EU. And a question to Krzysztof Bolesta. We have a clear message from the European Commission that CCS in power sector is not a priority. So does it mean that from the European Commission perspective, it makes bigger sense to use blue hydrogen for the flexibility purposes in the electricity sector, or does it make bigger sense to employ this CCS technology not during the production of hydrogen, but to employ it during the production of electricity and install CCS technology on the natural gas powered plant? Thank you.
Yes, would you answer first? Now that the question is fresh in your mind.
Thanks. Well, I don't know how to take this. I will not tell you what to do. I think it's fair to say that we are technology neutral, and when I said that CCS is not priority in the power generation, I just describe what the model threw up. I'm not saying that there will be no CCS in power generation, or that something is more important than something else. What a combination of our climate targets and modeling shows is that we will need everything. We will need everything, and the carbon price will drive many technologies, and I guess it will also drive CCS in the power generation. If it does, I'm not saying that hydrogen is worse or better. I think it's up to the market to decide. So I'm far from just pointing a finger and saying this is important, do that, and don't do something else. You will never hear us saying that.
Okay, maybe then I embark a bit on the specific hurdles that we see in Central and Eastern Europe. I think they are probably not so different than the hurdles in other countries. you have to imagine that you know, in the US, this EOR thing, and in Canada, it's already there since 10, 15 years. So, and also the development of the CCS project in Western Europe, they took like 10 years before everyone understands what this is about and governments understand how you give out a responsible way of a permit and how stakeholders. I think maybe the main difference is that in Eastern Europe, in many cases, it will be onshore. And in Europe, we are a bit unfamiliar with this. However, in Canada and in the US, everything is onshore. And in principle, you can way better control things onshore than offshore, but we need to learn it. So I think the only challenge which still is there is to go faster than the others through the learning curve. And I think Eastern European regulators and bodies and scientists, etc., they all should try to take advantage that other countries have already gone through some learning curve and translate that to your own specific situation, because it can never be a one-to-one copy, but the advantage is that it can be done faster. So you don't need to take 10 to 15 years to go through the learning curve, but maybe only 2 to 3 years. And but it's a lot of work for governments and for NGOs, for society to make that to go through that curve.
Thank you both.
Thank you. For now, I would like to close the discussion, as we have also Q&A session after the panel discussion, so surely there will be opportunity to ask more questions. Now we have another question for you. Okay, the link is on the chat, and please open and please answer the question which you can see. And now I would like to pass the floor to Luciana, who will tell more about the project.
Thank you very much, Isabella, and welcome to everyone. It's a pleasure to be presenting to you some first results from the project that Karolina presented to you. So I'm from the Energy Policy Group. We were the work package lead for the part of the project that is now concluded, which was an assessment of the current context and opportunities for CCS in the 11 partner countries in Central and Eastern Europe as part of this project. There's a bit about EPG. So we are an energy and climate think tank based in Bucharest, Romania. The work that we do focuses quite a lot on the Central and Eastern Europe region, but we try to place all the work that we do in a European and global context. As mentioned, we were the lead on work package 3, and we were also responsible for conducting the assessment of Romania as part of this project. So just to kick us off, this may not be surprising to anyone really, but in order to talk about CCS, we need to look firstly where emissions actually are. And there are plenty of them in Central and Eastern Europe. They have decreased since the end of the communist regime, mostly due to the closing or operational improvement of heavy industry. However, the carbon intensity of economies in the region, here you can see the partner countries mapped out in terms of the carbon intensity of their economies. This is higher than the EU average, which was 0.18 kilograms of CO2 per current US dollar, I believe, in 2019. You can see that there are some standout countries in the region, especially Ukraine, but also Poland and Estonia, which have very high carbon intensities of their economies. And related to that, there is a continued high reliance on fossil fuels for energy production. You can see that all the partner countries, except for 2, are higher than the European average when it comes to what percentage of their energy comes from fossil fuels. And many of these fossil fuels are combusted in old thermal power plants, many of them being coal-fired, which also raises the question of efficiency of energy production. So we are very much aware that there's fossil fuel dependency in the region, and combusting fuels, fossil fuels, supplies public utilities, but also the manufacturing industries. And we do get a lot of emissions from fuel combustion for the manufacturing industry. A higher share of emissions than in the EU average comes from combusting these fuels to provide energy to large manufacturing sectors, which are also very important to the economies of these countries. For example, iron and steel in Slovakia and Ukraine, petroleum refining in Lithuania, and crucially, non-metallic mineral products, which include cement in most of the partner countries. But when we look at process emissions, things become even more striking. So Jan was mentioning in his presentation the difficulty of abating these process emissions in the cement industry. And if we look at the countries studied in this project, cement production is the largest driver of process emissions in most of them. And just to give you a taste of other manufacturing industries with large process emissions, in Ukraine, the process emissions from the metallurgy sector are equivalent to more than half of all metallurgy process emissions in the entire EU 28. And we also see other striking contributions of industries. For example, in Lithuania, the chemical industry has a share 9 times higher of process emissions from their total national emissions compared to the EU average. And where are these emissions exactly generated? We can obviously see a familiar face here. The Bellona power plant in Poland is the largest emitter in the region. It is, however, due to shut by 2036. And overall, Poland has the largest contribution to emissions overall in partner countries, followed by Ukraine. Worth caveating here that the data we had to work with from Ukraine was fairly limited. The data that was used to produce this map with the point source emitters was the EU ETS database for European Union countries. And for Ukraine, we relied on the data provided by the experts we worked with in Ukraine, as well as Ukraine's national inventory report, the most recent one, applying the IPCC methodology to work out the emissions of their coal-fired power plants. There are obviously variations. We have some very high emitting countries. However, Baltic states contribute very little for obvious reasons. For example, in Latvia, we don't see any point source emitters that emit more than 1 megaton of CO2 with most recent data. Another obvious fact is that most of these emitters are thermal power plants, mostly coal-fired, but we do see industry emitters as well that fall into the category of more than 1 megaton CO2 emitted per year. The largest one being the US Steel Košice plant in Slovakia and the Liberty Galat steel plant in Romania. And Poland also has a notable share of industry points sources for CO2 emissions. And it's worth also mentioning that some of these large industrial emitters get their fuel from large coal-fired power stations that are situated nearby. So wrapping all of this up, there is clearly a potential for emissions to be captured in the region. But what about storing them? Where could it be stored? Indicatively, and this is again caveated by the fact that a lot more research is needed to really refine the geological storage potential in Central and Eastern Europe, but indicatively, we are looking at about 92 gigatons of CO2 storage potential in the region. And to give you an idea, the region, the partner countries, including Ukraine, their total CO2 emissions in 2019 were less than a gigaton. So there is potential to store these emissions for a prolonged period of time. And if we zoom into particular promising regions, the Ukraine's Donbas region in eastern Ukraine has apparently a phenomenal geological storage potential, although further work needs to be done to refine these estimates, which some studies project as high as 458 gigatons of CO2 storage capacity. And most of this capacity is in saline aquifers. You will have seen from the map that Jan showed as well. And while the potential is higher than in hydrocarbon reservoirs, the situation is that the hydrocarbon reservoirs are better studied than the saline aquifers. This comes from the history of the oil and gas industry in the region, meaning we have more refined studies on the geological storage potential of hydrocarbon reservoirs than saline aquifers. Not all countries are as lucky as Ukraine. We have negligible storage potential in Estonia, relatively low in Lithuania and Slovenia. There is an interesting potential for carbon storage via mineral carbonation, but a lot more study needs to be done to refine this. We see serpentinite deposits in southern Lithuania and bischofite deposits in Ukraine that could potentially be used for mineral carbonation for storing CO2. And when it comes to transportation, we see that large industrial emitters traditionally have good access to road and rail networks, and gas pipelines, including transporter ones, could be reused for CO2 transport. However, this is subject to technical and logistical constraints. And interestingly, although needing again further study, multimodal transport could be possible in countries with large rivers and marine access, such as Romania and Ukraine. However, CO2 transport infrastructure is basically non-existent, and there is little in the way of regulating it at country level as well. So we have emissions and we do have storage potential. What about the know-how and experience necessary to make CCS a reality in this region? Compared to Northwestern Europe, to obvious countries such as Norway and the Netherlands, there is relatively little experience in implementing CCS projects. We've already heard highlighted the CCS demonstrator that was planned at Balcato. There's also the Jetica project in Romania, which was planned for 2011, but both of these projects were subsequently abandoned. There is experience with carbon capture and utilization within the chemical industry in the region. Obviously, the business case for CCU for the chemical industry, which uses CO2 for its products, is quite clear. And given the maturity of the oil and gas industries in the region, there is experience with enhanced oil recovery and enhanced gas recovery using CO2, for example, in Hungary and Croatia. And alongside all of this, we are seeing an impetus for CCS applications. We have project announcements, as you heard, from HeidelbergCement for the Croatia cement plant in Poland. We have the 2030 strategy of OMV Petrom in Romania, which is set to include CCS, and the Klaipėdos Nafta Consortium in Lithuania that is planning a carbon capture and liquefaction project in the port city of Klaipėda. And alongside this promising new impetus, the second dawn, as Chris called it, for CCS, any CCS projects that would be implemented in the region do have a good foundation of academic research and experience. There are a number of institutions in partner countries that have participated in international CCS projects that are part of international CCS networks. So the academic experience and know-how is there. This is a table that was produced by WiseEuropa as part of the regional cooperation report for this project. And you'll see that partner countries do have participation in a selection of international projects. Poland seems to be leading here with their participation in projects, followed by the Czech Republic. And just a caveat, this is just a snapshot. These are not all the projects that partner countries have been involved in, simply the largest and most accessible. Okay, so we have emissions, we have storage, and we have know-how. What about the eternal question of regulation? So the favorability of regulatory environments in the region does vary, in particular on CO2 storage and transportation. There are a couple of partner countries which outright ban CO2 storage. These are Latvia, Lithuania, and Slovenia. You'll notice that Ukraine is also highlighted in this map as not allowing CO2 storage. This is not entirely correct. They simply don't have any provisions for it in national legislation. On the other hand, in some cases, there is confusing and conflicting regulation on CO2 storage. For example, in the Baltic states, some regulations seem to allow CO2 storage while others prohibit it. So there's definitely work to be done to ensure coherence and consistency of regulation. And in other countries, even if CO2 storage is permitted with restrictions or without, we do see administrative bottlenecks that make CO2 storage projects quite difficult in terms of gaining the required permits and implementing them. And this is despite the fact that competent authorities are registered to deal with CO2 storage. That's on the storage side, which is a big part of the CCS value chain. We also see there's insufficient regulation on carbon capture and utilization, and there is a lack of clarity on where enhanced hydrocarbon recovery using CO2 falls within the CCS regulation. This is something that needs to be clarified also at EU level, in addition to partner countries. And looking to the future, aside from the regulatory frameworks, we don't see too much CCS in long-term policies or strategies for the partner countries. It's often mentioned as a transition solution, but very little support is actually assigned to it when it comes to national policies and strategies for energy or for industry. Possibly the most important work that we did in this project was to work with stakeholders. So across the 11 partner countries, our partners in the consortium spoke to a total of 176 stakeholders, many of them coming from industry, but also representatives from authorities, NGOs, and the academic environment. And overall, what we found is that stakeholders in general were optimistic about the potential for CCS, but still cautious given a number of barriers that are related to the technologies themselves, such as high costs, but also related to the environments within which CCS would be deployed. So the lack of clear government support and frameworks to draw down the available EU financing into partner countries, challenging administrative procedures for obtaining required licenses and permits, especially for storage, and issues related to CO2 leakage from geological storage, as well as the required storage infrastructure being very complex. Indeed, in some partner countries, we found that stakeholders generally had a preference for CCU, including enhanced oil recovery, over CCS. And this was, quoting here, our interaction with some stakeholders in Romania, seeing CCS as more of a laissez-faire mentality, where storing the CO2 underground leaves it as a problem for future generations, which stakeholders seem to be reticent to in some cases. When it comes to what needs to happen in the region to deploy CCS, all stakeholders highlighted that regional and intersectoral cooperation is very important, which is promising for a project that is focusing on regional cooperation. And just a couple of the recommendations, because we did get a lot from stakeholders, were to develop and establish the financing frameworks necessary to draw down relevant funding, increase and make more consistent regulatory support. This includes actually giving CCS a place in national strategies and policies to really boost investor confidence when it comes to engaging in CCS projects. And all stakeholders highlighted the importance of kickstarting public dialogue when it comes to CCS, and just shifting a bit towards what's the public perception of CCU and CCS in the region. Overall, we see very limited knowledge about CCS as a technology in Central and Eastern Europe, at least in these partner countries. Knowledge is low, and the wider issues of climate change within which CCU or CCS could be nested is not a priority compared to the rest of the European Union. And public opposition could be a real threat. We do have a history of opposition to other similar projects, gold mining and fracking projects in the Czech Republic and Romania, or CCS projects such as Bolesta in Poland. And this is not helped by the fact that mistrust in government and industrial actors may pose a challenge to opening a dialogue with the public and building a public narrative around CCS. Additionally, we do have fairly vague positioning on CCS from institutions. Authorities seem to have little official position, with some exceptions, and the media narratives are barely existent. It's really apparent here that the need for addressing social acceptance of CCU and CCS in partner countries is threefold. Firstly, we need a robust position from leading and trustworthy institutions. Secondly, concerted dialogue and education of the public on climate change and CCS, and relevant and factual media coverage. Now, the challenge here is that given the socioeconomic status of partner countries, where day-to-day struggles are really plentiful for a large part of the population, transparency issues are also common, and the media is often political. The social acceptance aspects of CCS projects may be one of the underestimated challenges of deploying these technologies. Just to give a quick conclusion, the emissions in partner countries are obviously there, and we can't yet rule out CCS for the energy sector. This is in part due to the fact that some of the partner countries have very far away decarbonization targets, timelines for decarbonization, and as was mentioned before, CCS for gas may become a necessity in coal-dependent countries in the region, which will require natural gas as a transition fuel. The geological potential is there and is significant in some countries, less so in others. So we really need to be adopting a regional look for how countries with less storage potential might be able to work with ones with higher storage potential to potentially build transporter CO2 storage clusters. The know-how is there. It's more academic than practical in some countries, but there is a good basis of know-how upon which to build CCS projects. The big challenge is around regulation, which needs a lot of work to improve consistency, signal investor confidence. And when it comes to stakeholders, many of them are cautious, given that there are multiple barriers to deploying CCS, and recommendations primarily center around financial and regulatory aspects. And finally, can't stress enough the importance of social acceptance, given that the public is uninformed, but could potentially oppose CCS projects. And I'll leave it at that, just with one note that this presentation is a summary of another summary of a very comprehensive set of work that has been done in this work package. We have 11 national reports detailing the situation in the partner countries. We have a summary report, which is over 100 pages long. If that is a bit too long for you, we also have an executive summary, and these are all available on the project website, which I've linked here. And with that, I will stop. Thank you, and hand back to Isabel.
Thank you very much, Luciana. And before we go to presentation of national reports to the panel discussion moderated by Michał Wendołowski from Bellona, we will make a short break of 5 minutes. But in the meantime, we would like to invite you to answer 2 other open questions. The first link you can see already in the chat, and the question will be closed after 15 minutes, and I will send another one. The first is, what do you think is the biggest barrier to CCS deployment in CCE? This is an open question, so please feel free to write everything you think is the most important. And in that, we can meet like 20 past 11. Thank you.
Move on and start. Yes, so hello again. I think we can now start with our panel discussion. I hope everyone had a good break, although I don't think there's anything such a thing like a 5 minutes break doesn't really exist. People need a bit more time, but I'll make sure to slow down a bit so people join us again. My name is Michał Wendołowski, and I'm a technology and climate technology and policy manager at Bellona, Europa. So we are one of the project partners in the CCS for CEE project, and I will have the pleasure to moderate this panel discussion. So I'm about to introduce our panelists, but before I do, I want to say that this is very likely the most knowledgeable collective of experts when it comes to CCS developments in Central and Eastern Europe that you can come across today, as these people have been researching this topic for the last year or so, and some of them much longer than that. So I'm really looking forward to hear their insights, building up on the presentations by our speakers earlier today with CCS in Central and Eastern Europe, and how can we make it happen. So again, I encourage you to have a look at questions that Isabella has put, or will put in the chat. And so now moving on to the introduction of our panelists, the audience will already know Karolina Marszał from WiseEuropa, who introduced the project earlier on, and Luciana from EPG. Karolina will share her insights regarding Poland, and Luciana will talk about CCS in Romania and Hungary. Then going from the northernmost parts of Central and Eastern Europe, I would like to introduce Ervinas Shkikunas, Associate Partner at Civita, a Central Eastern European consultancy company headquartered in Estonia. Ervinas has been leading Civita's work in the project, covering the Baltic countries, Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania. We then have Volodymyr Buzan, Civita's associated expert within the CCS for CEE project, who conducted research and stakeholders engagement in Ukraine. Then Michał Hruby, research fellow at Europeum, a Prague-based European policy think tank. Michał will talk about CCS in Czechia and Slovakia. Marko Maver, Assistant Director at National Laboratory for Health, Environment and Food, formerly State Secretary at the Ministry of Environment and Spatial Planning in Slovenia, and a long-standing expert on CCS and the author of the CCS report on Slovenia. And last but not least, we have Domagoj Vulin, professor at University of Zagreb, the Department of Petroleum and Gas Engineering and Energy, and a leading author of the CCS report on Croatia. So before we start the actual discussion, I would like to suggest a bit of a change to the agenda, as we originally planned to have the panel discussion, which would then be followed by the discussion with the public. But I would like to mix it up a bit and encourage our audience to participate also during the panel together with us. So let's see how that works. So now turning to our dear panelists, as we learned from Krzysztof Bolesta's presentation, we now know that CCS is well recognized as a tool that can help Europe achieve climate neutrality. But is this realization common at the member states level? So in other words, are Central Eastern European governments counting on CCS in their climate plans, industry decarbonization strategies, or hydrogen deployment strategies? So that would be my first question, but I would like to connect our discussion with the questions that we have or will be asking the audience through the quiz platform. So could all panelists also give us an overview of the key barriers that you identified for your research? And let's keep it to maximum 2 key barriers per country, and then 1 or 2 key recommendations coming from the stakeholders that you engaged with so far. So again, what is the role of CCS in your country climate strategies? Then what is the key, what are the key barriers and what are the key recommendations? So maybe I would like to start with the southernmost country. So Domagoj, could you please give us your perspective from Croatia?
Hi to all. Well, the key barriers in Croatia. The main obstacle to the introduction of CCS is that emissions in Croatia are not so high due to small industry and population decline, as we found out from the events we organized for CCS, for CU, which would reduce the need for energy, which in the future will be electrical energy. This means that some stakeholders see the opportunity for funding of renewables exclusively, and they see others as competition and not as the alternatives that can complement in CO2 mitigation. So I don't know, to be more specific, I see no reason not to credit the CO2 stored during the CCS or even during the CO2 EOR process until the cradle-to-grave approach, life cost analysis shows that the project is carbon negative. I think that's the most important thing to calculate all CO2 produced by combustion and all CO2 which is stored, and to show that that much higher amounts of CO2 could be removed by storage than by using other available technologies. And well, for recommendations, this is very connected with the first part. Well, stakeholders should not only focus on their core businesses, and they can be extended to media, ministries and agencies for lack of an integrated strategy. So, well, maybe the most important recommendation is therefore to force the networking of all stakeholders involved in the technologies of the energy transition to be able to make comparative CO2 life cycle analysis cradle to grave and of all available technologies. I think that should be the most important things, at least in Croatia.
Okay, well, thanks a lot. Now moving on to Marko. Marko, what about Slovenia?
I think this, can you hear me well?
Yes.
Brilliant. Just double checking. I think Slovenia is an interesting case. We have CCS written in our National Energy and Climate Plan as a potential solution that will lead to decarbonization. Our goal being carbon neutrality by 2050. So technically it is mentioned in government issued documents. However, there is little to no action being taken in terms of encouraging project development, which goes to show that there's very little political interest in actually developing having CCS being a climate mitigation tool. Having said that, there are there's some players who are still looking at CCS or CCU being a potential tool for their decarbonization, one of them being Salonit, which is a cement manufacturer. They're taking actions on their own to get a pilot project developed by 2028. They have strong interest also for cross-border cooperation. The Chemical Institute, for example, in Slovenia is also doing some research into direct air capture. So having said that, there is, like I said, there's CCS written in government documents, but very little support. I think that being one of the key barriers for CCU or CCUS taking off in Slovenia. So lack of political support and consequently also lack of initial funding for pilot and demo projects. So from the stakeholder workshops that we've held, that was one of the key recommendations made from those interested in CCUS, that initial funding should be made from the government to develop a pilot or demonstration scale project, and then the industry would go from there on their own. And also, I think public engagement and communication, that also one of the key recommendations, because very little is being discussed in the media in general in terms of climate change communication. And also speaking with NGOs and other stakeholders, CCS is still being primarily mentioned in the context of TEŠ, which is the largest coal power plant in Slovenia. And there's almost no discussion or knowledge, for that matter, in terms of how CCU or CCUS could be used in decarbonizing energy-intensive industries. So there was some effort made in terms of providing funding for a pilot scale project about 2 years ago. However, through the Climate Fund, which was identified as primary mechanism through which these projects and research could be funded. However, the new incoming government wasn't very supportive, or they've identified different priorities. So that measure was scrapped, so to speak. So that's kind of the situation in Slovenia. Key barriers being lack of political support and consequently funding for pilot projects, and public engagement and communication being a key, I think, first step recommendation.
It's very clear, Marco. Thanks a lot. So I'm going further north now to Luciana, who will give us her insights about Romania and Hungary.
Yes, absolutely. So starting with Romania, the presence of CCS in national policies and strategies is basically non-existent. There is no mention of CCS in the National Energy Strategy and National Energy and Climate Plan. The only place where carbon capture was mentioned was Romania's Recovery and Resilience Plan at the initial draft. The proposed projects, which involved CCU, were subsequently removed because of issues around competitiveness of the tender by which the project consortium was formed. Beyond that, there isn't basically anything around CCS in Romanian national strategies. Similar with Hungary, although I think there is mention of CCS in Hungary's new energy strategy as a potential enabling technology, but once again, very much a transition solution. So I think it's quite missing a concrete role for CCS in specific industries or sectors, as well as the required support mechanisms for it. And now with regards to the main barriers, I think that, Domagoj and Marco have covered the most important ones, because these are really ubiquitous in Central and Eastern Europe and across Europe indeed. In Romania, I defer to the stakeholders here, whose expert views have led to the main barrier being identified as an institutional one, which is the lack of government involvement, and also a perceived inertia from industry as well, which might be shifting now that we see more industry actors coming out in Romania with proposals around CCS. And the recommendation linked to that is obviously more coherence at national government level with regards to CCS as a priority for Romania. And with regards to implementation as well, there is a bit of confusion in Romania around the responsibility of different government departments with regards to CCS. So one recommendation, for example, was to have an interministerial efforts on developing a strategy or a roadmap for CCS in Romania. When it comes to Hungary, the main barrier that was highlighted here by stakeholders was a financial one. So these are the high investment and operating costs for CCS and CCU. It should be highlighted though that MOL in Hungary is a company with a lot of experience in EOR, and as I think either Jan or Chris were mentioning, they are currently looking into carbon capture as part of their long-term strategy, but financing still does seem to be a barrier in Hungary. And the recommendation linked to that is to develop and establish a financing framework to draw down the EU funding for developing pilot and demo projects, and then looking at some kind of long-term financing framework for the operational costs, which make it into discussion a bit less. But here, for example, carbon contracts for difference could be a solution for covering the operational costs of CCS projects.
Great, very clear. Thanks, Luciana. Michał, you have been looking at Czech Republic and Slovakia. Also, what's the picture there?
Yeah, thank you, Michał, and then thanks to all the participants today. I see many stakeholders, even from Czech Republic and Slovakia, so I'm happy that we made this happen. So for both Czech Republic and Slovakia, when we talk about some national plans and roadmaps, I would say that it's almost the same. CCS is mentioned from time to time in our energy and the climate plans, but usually it's more given that the technology itself is still underdeveloped. There are some questions about its economic feasibility. So it is mentioned from time to time, but there is no focus on that. Mostly because of the reason that it, according to these plans, cannot be deployed really fast. So it's more like some question to the future. Both in Czech Republic and in Slovakia, we have quite the same barrier, and that's that the EU CCS directive has been transposed to national law, but there is still like some further implementing decree missing. So when it comes really to the practical point of having a commercial project, there is no rule set about financial guarantees and financial reserves connected to the geological works of storage. So de facto, it means that some commercial storage is not really possible at the moment. But the good thing is that there is a dialogue between ministries and all the stakeholders. So actually, these implementing decrees could be drawn during the 2022, but of course, we will see. The question, of course, then remains about other barriers, because then we still talk about a large capacity with aquifers, but actually these aquifers are not really explored in detail. We only have some rough preliminary exploration, but nothing more. So much more of work must be done in this regard. And as we already heard in the presentation before, there are companies like MND, oil and gas company in Czech Republic. There's also Slovnaft as a part of MOL group in Slovakia. So they are actively playing in this field. And of course, we have many different technical universities to cover even the capture projects, or let's say this innovative technologies in regards to capture. We have Czech Geological Survey to take care about the geological research, but still, as it was mentioned even before, more finances are needed. More interest from the side of government is expected. And maybe finally, I will just mention that, of course, we would probably need some more of a human capital to work on such project, because it's really complex, and it's not that couple of people in Czech Republic would be able to handle it all. So that's probably like a summary of Czech Republic and Slovakia. Thank you.
Yes, Michał, you are muted.
Apologies. So now I was gonna ask Karolina now about the situation in Poland.
Sure. So I can say that CCS and CCU doesn't play a major role in Polish national planning documents. In the Polish National Energy and Climate Plan, it's just the mention of CCS and CCU technology. Energy policy of Poland until 2040 declares that CCS and CCU technology will be researched and implemented, but doesn't provide in-depth strategy describing how CCS will be developed in Poland, so also no specific target and timeline is set out. And the Polish hydrogen strategy states that until 2030, an installation producing hydrogen from natural gas or coal with the use of CCS, CCU may be put into operation. But therefore, I can say that Poland lacks a strategic approach towards CCU and CCS, which would outline how this technology should be included in the Polish future energy system. And moving on to the barriers, there are three main categories of barriers in Poland: economic, legislative, and social acceptance issues. In terms of economic, there's a high cost of the technology together with insufficient financial incentives. And namely, there's no national financial support system for CCS, and external funds are sometimes just not sufficient. Moreover, there is also necessity to pay fees related to the granting of a concession for exploration of underground CO2 storage sites. And moving on to the legislative barriers, it is very interesting because as for now, the Polish law allows only for demonstrations, CCS projects. Moreover, they need to have, they have too ambitious minimum storage thresholds, which is proved by the fact that over the last 9 years since passing the Geological and Mining Law Act, no CCS demonstration project has been successfully developed. Also, it is very important that underground CO2 storage complexes can be located only in the limited offshore areas in the Baltic Seas, and onshore storage is just prohibited. So as a result, the geological potential cannot be even properly assessed. Also, exploring the underground CO2 storage sites as well as transportation via pipelines can be performed upon obtaining a specific concession, and the obligation of monitoring the storage sites for a period of at least 20 years after the end of its operation, and also it is connected with this fees. The interesting part is that in November this year, so 1 month ago, the draft act amending this law was presented. Limitation to demonstration projects is to be lifted up, so there would be no limits and the requirements concerning the amount of stored CO2, which allows for both pilot and commercial projects. However, a ban on onshore CO2 storage is to be maintained, so this is not a wholesome solution. Regarding recommendations in terms of regulation, stakeholders indicated that there should be consent to onshore CO2 storage and conducting commercial CCS projects, and also a simplification of administrative procedures. And now the second recommendation can apply to the public acceptance issues, because in Poland there is a strong not under my backyard attitude, and concerns around CCS is related to the safety of underground CO2 storage, mainly due to the limited or inexistent knowledge about the technology. So preparing a comprehensive risk assessment of CO2 geological storage to address fear of carbon leakage may be a solution, and also promoting this technology through local organizations to launch the debate not only on a national level, but also on the local level. Moreover, stakeholders think that the first successful pilot installations can fight the myth and facilitate a favorable attitude of the peoples for CCS in Poland. Thank you.
Thanks, Karolina. So sort of a mixed picture emerges so far as we heard from various countries. But now moving on to Volodymyr and the situation in Ukraine.
Yeah, thanks. So to cut a long story short, basically carbon capture, carbon storage technologies are not specifically on the map if we look on the strategic documents, but I have to mention that the low carbon strategy of Ukraine implies further assessment of carbon capture and carbon storage technologies application in Ukraine, because we have quite a good potential for that. And in addition, several big companies and who are the largest emitters of CO2 have put that on the strategy, but just on the high level, that they will consider the development of CCS, CCU projects. After that, currently, we are in such situation when we have approved the new national determined contribution within the Paris Climate Agreement just recently. And after that, we have to update all strategic documents and so on, according to our new climate goals, which are quite significant, I would say, and they reach the target reaches by 2030 35% of emission from the baseline from the base year 1990. So it implies quite significant efforts and investments from both companies and consumers if we talk about the energy sector. And basically we expect that currently, as the energy strategy is under review and will be updated, we are closely working on also lobbying, so to say, CCS, CCU projects be showcased in this strategy, first of all. And secondly, also we have a certain interest from the Ministry of Environment. They are still a young ministry that has been recently established and divided from the Ministry of Energy, and they are studying and generating their own capacity to study the new technologies and CCS, CCU in particular. And they are looking forward to generating their own position towards these technologies, as it is still not defined and regulated anyway legally. Other aspect that is important that will drive the market, as I see within the next couple of years, is the technical regulation of the gas transportation system, which implies the amount of CO2 which can be in the transportation system, which is quite critical for Ukraine. And so, as I see, the key issue there is that most producers do not meet that criteria, and the amount of CO2 is too high in order to get into the gas system. That will force them to emit. That will force them to take the CO2 out of the gas, so to say. And as a result, they have to utilize the CO2 or store it. The first option is they consider it in order to increase the pressure within the mining industry. But on the other hand, they imply that they could produce methanol, but still the demand on the methanol in Ukraine is not that significant as the amount of CO2 that will be extracted from gas. So in order to cope with that issue, companies are strongly and significantly considering CCS, CCU technologies, so that they will be able to take that environmental responsibility and to utilize the CO2 or simply to store it, as they have a potential for that. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you, Volodymyr. So before, could you just mute yourself? Thanks. Before I ask Eredinas, I'd like to encourage people to have a look at the question that we have put about the key barriers. We already have a couple of answers. Would be good to get some more insights from our audience. And so now, Eredinas, so you've been looking at the Baltic states. Tell us more about that.
Yeah, thanks, Michał. I guess the fact that I'm representing all three Baltic states, which is Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania, tells you something about the size of industry and the size of carbon, or the amount of carbon that we need to capture. But anyway, so in the documents, carbon capture is more or less mentioned sporadically as on some branches of decarbonization, mostly in energy sector, nothing too concrete. Maybe there will be some more detail after Estonia publishes its hydrogen strategy. Well, hopefully this year, Lithuania is starting its own hydrogen strategy as well. So should be available more or less in the next 6 months or something like that. Maybe Latvia will come up with something of their own as well. So just to give you an understanding of what we're talking about in terms of carbon that needs to be captured. So if you take the ETS system and you just see which companies or which emitters have emissions that are large enough so that industrial scale carbon capturing can be deployed, we're looking at like 10 companies in all 3 countries. But if you look individually in these companies, they are more or less the largest companies in their industry. They're one of the largest taxpayers, and they are one of the largest employers in their respective region. And they know that 2030, 2050 is coming. The carbon, the carbon price is increasing, and the companies themselves are doing really, let's say, I would say, well. They're acquiring knowledge. They are, let's say, thinking about maybe some pilot projects in several countries. But maybe the most acute, not problem, but issue is, okay, let's say the carbon prices do not drop in the summer, but they increase like to 1,000 euros, right? Then what? Even if you capture that carbon, you can't really transport it anywhere, and you can't store it anywhere because there is no, there are a lot of questions around that. So I guess these companies that are procuring this knowledge, maybe trying to find out what kind of capturing technologies they could use. They still see, and this is factual, that transportation is not sorted out, but some stakeholders are actually have started dealing with that question, as Luciana, for instance, mentioned. Klaipėdos Nafta is looking into the transportation chains and different stakeholders as well. So I would say that's one. And second, so from the government side, so we have, for instance, in Lithuania, there is this energy ministry that is rather active in that, but the most active, let's say, stakeholders are these companies. And what do businesses want? They want knowledge of how much will something cost and what would be the quantity, so they can ship. So currently those 2 questions are not answered. What they can answer is how much would that cost, to actually capture that carbon, or at least move with pilot projects. But the transportation, the storage itself, it's not really clear, and that's, I guess, roadblocks. And also just exploring opportunities would be nice to, it would be nice to have an opportunity to explore opportunities. So for instance, now we are talking only probably about shipping the stored carbon away from the countries, but and that's probably the only option for Estonia, because you can't really store carbon, underground. But in Latvia and Lithuania, it is theoretically possible, but on the other hand, it is forbidden, by law. So it might be an idea to try and see, okay, maybe let's do some pilot projects. And these pilot projects also take time. It's not like two weeks and whether it is good or not. It takes years, right? So if we start earlier, we get the results earlier. So I would say like that. Industry is not super large here, but individual companies are quite large comparatively. Most of them are thinking about either pilot projects or just acquiring information. And they're waiting, okay, what will happen next? And I guess that's one of the questions we want to jointly answer in the next few years as well.
That's awesome. Thanks, Ervinas. And it's a lot of great insights, and I think many commonalities across various countries, as we can see. In most cases, business is willing to take action, but that's not sufficient. There is absolutely some need and some room for governments to step in. The least that could be done, I suppose, is to at least remove the obstacles at the regulatory level, or at least recognize the role. Take the example from the EU. EU has recognized the role of CCS, and I suppose it would be really helpful if governments could also recognize the role of CCS in emissions abatement and achieving the net zero targets. So we now have the second question, where we would like to hear from the audience, or to see from the audience what recommendations people think are key. And while you will be answering that question, I'd like to invite you to ask questions already at this stage. So the floor is yours, our dear audience. Please shoot. If you could just raise your hand, introduce yourself, and what your affiliation, tell you what your affiliation is. I don't see any hands raised. I'll just give it another minute, so maybe people want to answer the slide question. Oh, great. Jakub, please go ahead.
Thanks, Michał. Just a short question. We've received a map of individual states in the region, but do you have any thoughts about possibilities for cooperation between different states or different companies, companies from different states in the region regarding CCS or CCU projects? Thanks.
Does anyone want to take this question from our panel?
I'm happy to give it a shot. Thanks, Jakub. It's a really great question, and possibly Karolina can come in a little bit with the insights from the Regional Cooperation Report, which is also available on the project website. But say, from my point of view, there are two aspects here, right? One is, can we talk about CCUS clusters, and can we talk about transporter clusters? We've shown you that pretty basic map of the point sources of emissions in the region, and you might have noticed that some of them seem to be clustered quite close together. There's, for example, southwestern Poland, northeastern Czech Republic. There seem to be a lot of industrial emitters in the area. So we could be talking about potential trans-border CCUS clusters here, where you use the geological storage potential of a specific area and transport the captured emissions from emitters in that area, which would reduce the storage and transport infrastructure costs. Maybe Michał, who we can also speak to this a little bit, because there was a project that assessed the potential for a trans-border CCS cluster involving, I think, the Czech Republic and Austria. So there is work that has been done in that respect, sort of clustering emission sources together to a transport CO2 storage project. And the second aspect I would mention is when it comes to companies that operate within these countries, you see parent companies that have CCS experience, like cement companies, for example, and they develop that experience potentially in other areas in Central and Eastern Europe. But then through the national companies underneath this parent company, there's the opportunity to transfer that know-how and to start looking at pilot projects in Central and Eastern Europe as well. So that's just my 2 cents on the subject. Maybe Karolina or Michał want to come in here.
Yes, I can. Oh, Karolina, please go.
Okay, just I totally agree with you, Luciana, and also I would like to add that there are plenty of possibilities to establish this cooperation via coordination forums, for example, via Visegrad Group, 3Cs Initiative, Baltic Sea Region Energy Cooperation, European Network of Excellence on the Geological Storage of CO2, and the European Network for Research in Geoenergy. So there's also a possibility to establish this connection and start cooperation from these political agendas.
Yeah, and I will just quickly add that, yes, it's true that there were some studies made, for example, on the border of Czech Republic, Slovakia, and Austria, which was a project called ENOS, enabling onshore CO2 storage. And it's true that there are some national level legislations which don't really allow for some transboundary projects when we talk about storage. Because, for example, there was a one field studied in Czech Republic, which is actually on the border with Slovakia. From the other side, from the side of Slovakia, it's actually not possible to store the CO2 in this location because of some different aspects of protection of the nature and protected zones. So there are different reasons why it's not that easy to make such a project happen. And of course, then we talk about some individual level projects which are planned in Czech Republic in this location right now, as we heard about CO2 Spicer and so on. But these do not really focus on some clusters. But I think Chris Bolesta mentioned it at the very beginning that there is a planned project of common interest in Poland, which may be some a possibility in the future to have some transport hub in this region, but of course it's a question of many years.
Dear colleagues, if you would allow, I would like to step in just for a second. From my point of view, in terms of Ukraine, there are few opportunities to cooperate with other countries, as the vast majority of storage facilities that we consider could be ideal for CCS projects are in the eastern part of Ukraine, and the leverage or the transportation costs would be too high. For example, if we would work with other countries, but there is a potential for cooperation between the companies in the eastern part of Ukraine. What I mean is, for example, between companies can be joint storage facilities because we have quite closely to each other located heat power plants and metallurgy plants, which are one of the largest emitters, and they are even within one company. And I had recently a conversation with the technical director of Metinvest, that's a metallurgy company, and he conducted an assessment of various technologies which could be used in order to reduce the emission for their production facilities. And I asked him, why don't you consider the carbon capture storage seriously? He said, because the costs are too high. But on the other hand, they are not looking too far. And I mentioned him that why don't you talk to energy companies in order to define whether they would also like to store the CO2. And actually, they are studying this as well. And such a joint project would be more economically viable for both of them. Yeah, thanks.
Hello, can you hear me? This is Oleg Slinkevich. I would like to ask a question. As I look into the map, then in many countries of this region, we see that the geological storage of CO2 is not allowed on the political level, including in Latvia, where I'm coming from. And in Latvia, I am representing electric utility, and we are the biggest CO2 producer, Latvenergo. We are the biggest CO2 producer in the region. And the second biggest is cement producer, Schwenk. And together with Schwenk, we addressed a letter to our environmental ministry to reconsider this and to allow the geological storage. So maybe it's a good idea to talk about all these countries in this region. So if we want to go for the Green Deal, and then the CO2 storage, geological storage should be an option, and how to motivate it on the political level that such storage is allowed. Maybe quite a rhetorical question, sorry.
Oh, that sounds like a good idea. Before I ask before I ask Domagoj to comment, We are asking the same question as we asked in the beginning, just to see if your views have somehow changed during the conference as to the time frame of the industrial scale CCS project in Central and Eastern Europe. So I'd like to invite you to click on the link again, the one that Isabella has just dropped in the chat, and let's then compare the results. So let's do that in the meantime, and then I'd like to ask Maciej to ask his question or make a comment. Maciej?
Okay, I was just looking at the link, so sorry. Well, I will just put a comment on possibility or what's going on currently in Croatia and what are the main obstacles, why it's not having desired momentum. Well, we have on one side hydrocarbon production, which is not enough for our demand. And on the other side, from the government and let's say other interest groups, they are just using the, let's say, bright picture about renewables and want to just turn off the hydrocarbon production or anything that is connected with, let's say, geoenergy or use of underground in for any purpose. So that is very sad thing, because if we stopped our hydrocarbon production, it is pretty sure that we would increase our import of oil and gas. And so we are just producing around 40%, I think, of gas, and even less of oil that is needed for our country. And on the other side, we have a long tradition of CO2 EOR research. So for good CO2 EOR project, it is needed around 25 years to bring it to technological readiness level, which is sufficient to bring that project to commercial level. And we have two fields which are commercially producing with CO2. And on the other side, the problem in a mall company is that they don't have sufficient amounts of CO2 for CO2 EOR. So I would just again emphasize that in that let's say picture, it should be assessed how much CO2 is produced by combustion of all these produced fuels and how much is stored. Because when we are producing something, we are leaving more space for storing. That is not so obvious maybe to people who are not coming from geosciences. And on the other side, we have some projects for which I find very interesting, with CO2 capture, so gas fired power plant with CO2 capture, which is, I think, also a good thing. So if we consider that, they're all very close to each other. So that plant, power plant, cement company, and CO2 EOR plant, new plant CO2 EOR fields are very close to each other. So transport issues or transport costs would be very low. And I think just a small encouragement from media, which are just collecting information from foreign countries, not from Croatia. And Croatia, I think, by that means is somewhat different than most of European countries, or let's say European countries who are producing oil onshore or who researched underground onshore. And on the other side, they have good, I think, motivation to connect to clusters which will capture, transport, and store CO2. So I think the only problem with maybe several non-governmental organizations, several media, and maybe some corrections in legislative framework.
Yeah, thanks, Domagoj. I think that life cycle assessments should always be part of any EOR projects. But I guess everyone has to answer for themselves whether they support this idea to use EOR, even if it may have negative overall carbon footprint, as to see what for everyone to see what the role of fossil fuels is going forward. But that's maybe a big debate on its own. I need to wrap up our debate. I'll take, I think it was Major Pal was the first, and then Jan. Quickly, if you could just make very small, short questions, as we don't have much time to extend the debate. And I wanted to have another look at what people answered to the quiz questions. Thank you.
Well, thanks, Michael. I mean, I've just a quick question and a comment. So the comment first, here in Lithuania as well, you know, there is a storage of CO2 is basically banned. So that means, although on one of the charts that was shown that storage potential in Lithuania, Latvia already was pretty low compared to the other CE countries, but still, nevertheless, there's a lack of understanding because the CO2 is going to be stored deep, either in deep saline aquifer or in oil reservoirs, which are 2 to 3 kilometers deep. But the general perception is that it will somehow contaminate the water table, which seems like a lack of education. And the second part is that, since the question, now this was more of a comment, the question really is that without the participation of the energy companies, it's very hard to make this kind of project economic. And if the project is not economic, it is not going to work. As simple as that. And energy companies have an interest to produce oil and gas. And so for storage, you need all the expertise that sits with energy companies because they've been in the business of producing and storing for a number of years. So without that, it's pretty hard. And it might need some education as well to a lot of the maybe people at governmental levels who make these decisions.
I only heard two statements. Was there a question actually?
The question was more about how do you bring on board the storage part? You know, because we've been talking about the capture part, but the storage is the ultimate aim. And I hear a lot about capture, but the storage, how are we going to do it? Geological storage is environmentally unfriendly. Storage by energy companies is seen as bad because you end up producing hydrocarbon. So what are you going to do even if you capture it?
Yeah, I suppose we can look at Norway and Equinor, which is the mainly oil and gas company. Obviously, I don't think is something they are dreaming about to invest resources in storage, because that's maybe not the most profitable business. But if the state is ready to step in and provide some financing to also develop the transport and storage infrastructure, then I suppose that could improve the business case also for the storage side.
Yeah, and if I just may quickly add, it's not only about the hydrocarbon fields. I think that in some of our countries, there are also possibilities in coal fields and so on. And it can actually be helpful to the industry, which otherwise seems to be closing. So I think it's about other companies as well, included in mining and geology.
If I may add, Michał, a bit to the discussion. I think somehow I maybe already elaborated a bit on it, is on this EOR thing. Obviously, this is something that has pushed the developments in the US. We have to be aware that even in the US, a lot of new developments are all CCS related, because there are many locations where the oil fields are not nearby, and they are changing the regulation to more support CCS. And if you look to a business case in the US, the average price they pay for CO2 is like 30 euros or $30 per ton of CO2, something like this. And if you see that the EU ETS is nowadays 80 to 90 euros per ton, it's clear that the driving factor from the EU ETS is way larger than what oil companies are willing to pay for CO2. And it's not so obvious if you run an EOR business, it's not so obvious that you can deduct all your CO2 that you use for EOR from your EU ETS. And it can even be that it's only at the end of the lifetime of the project. So during the project, because part of the CO2 is being recirculated, and it's not so obvious, you cannot deduct all those CO2 volumes from your EU ETS credit. So you are missing out 90 euro per ton, and you might have a benefit of $30 per ton. And then it very, very quickly you can see that EOR is not the better economical approach anymore. And that's a new reality. And I think it's important that we see this new reality and embark further on CCS. And don't think that this will be paid by additional oil recovery, apart from stakeholder acceptance or the whole transition in itself.
Yeah, thanks, Jan. I agree with that. Now let's wrap up, and before we do that, let's look at the same question that we asked at the beginning. And I can see that the first time we asked this question, 2% of our audience actually thought that CCS will never happen at industrial scale in Central Eastern Europe. No, sorry, that was 2%. 2% thought that it will never happen. And we have 0% during the second round. So I suppose it's a sign that we managed to convince some people. Then within 5 years, it was 16%, and now it's 21%, so that's also optimistic. And within 10 years, it was 63%, and now it's 73%. Okay, so maybe people now think that it will take a bit more than 5 years, and then the result for more than 10 years was 18%. And now it's 8%. So I take it as an optimistic sign. I suppose people, having learned a bit more about CCS, maybe got a bit more hope as to the prospects of these technologies. Good. I will stop at that, and we'll take it. I'll hand it over to Karolina to wrap up. Thank you. Thank you to all the panelists and to our audience for a very interesting discussion.
Thank you, Michał. Thank you all. I hope that the discussion was valuable for you all, and looking into the next phase of our project, I would encourage all of you to participate and engage in consultations that our national experts will be conducting in the early 2022. And also we will be organizing a series of national seminars in the first quarter of next year. So we really count on you, and we hope you would like to share your valuable inputs with us. And also if you have just some ideas, comments, etc., do not hesitate to just write to us, or Michał, Luciana, or me, or any other partner. So I hope you enjoyed our event, our conference, and I'm giving the floor to Isabella for the final word. Thank you.
Thank you, Karolina. Thank you, all of you, for so much participation. It was a very interesting discussion. And I would like to add that we'll prepare the summary of the conference, and surely we will share the results with you, also the results of our polls, so you can also have a look. Thank you very much. Have a nice rest of the day, and see you for next time. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you.